why we check that, right?
Thank you.
So let me just move things over. Windows, too many screens. Hold on. Okay, and let me start this, and then I'll share my screen.
All right. Should have that little green button at the bottom. Everybody's done it by now.
Yep.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, no problem. Thank you guys for listening.
All right, let's make sure
Yep.
you guys can see this.
Yes, I have. It's already playing and everything. Father, SOC analyst, so on and so forth.
Boom, let's go back. All right, here we go. So my name is Christopher Lopez, and today I'm going to be talking about asking questions. And a little bit of this presentation is going to be about writing effectively. So we're going to talk about thinking about how you think in this presentation. I spend probably too much time thinking about how investigations work than actually doing investigations sometimes. I'll be honest, it happens. And there's something that really made me interested in this, and that was that when I started in cybersecurity, I was not technical at all. It was very difficult for me to gain a bunch of information very quickly when I joined the SOC. So when you join the SOC, for those that haven't or those that have been at a SOC, you are forced to deal with the water hose effect of, hey, this is just how things are, start learning. So the only thing that kept me afloat was the fact that I somehow figured out a way of asking questions effectively. So I spent, and I mean, it got to the point that many of my coworkers would be like, probably tired of all the questions that I would ask. But now I look for that in people that I train or anyone that I speak to in the field, because this is definitely one of the biggest things that can help anyone become better as an analyst. So let's kind of just run into this. So who am I? Number one, as always, I'm a father first. And of course, I am a SOC analyst. I've been a SOC analyst for some time, different companies. And I spend most of my time, of course, on the blue side of things as an investigator. And my superpower, I guess we can call it that, is I'm always asking questions. So let's talk about what we're here to discuss. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about the investigative process. And it's funny, you're going to notice that these are questions that we see often in other things in our lives. I think this applies to just about every facet of our lives, but in the context of investigating, they're incredibly powerful and they guide your entire investigation. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to talk about a little write-up example and probably give some more examples that I've had to investigate. So what do you need to be an incredible investigator? Not much. All you need is your mind, right? And your mind, we're going to encapsulate your questions, your biases. We'll talk a little bit about biases, your perspective, and of course, you're going to bring in your experiences. That's just the way that we are, right? So the next thing you need is you need to be able to take notes. Doesn't matter how you do it. While you're going through an investigation, I've seen some people that are very effective at typing incredibly fast. I wish that I was that fast at typing. I usually stick to one of these, notepad and a pen, and go from there. Of course, you need to have some kind of a loosely defined process to be a great investigator. And why am I emphasizing loosely? Well, because I feel that when we're talking about investigation, if you have a very strict process, I'll give you an example, like IR, right? Incident response. If it's very strict and you have to be by the books, what I've seen is that actually removes some of the creativity and some of the, thoughts that an analyst would have that can guide investigation and lead to a pivot that, may reveal information that's very important for an investigation. So I try to leave it at a loosely defined. And of course, in a team setting, your team members, definitely try to lean on them as you learn to become a better investigator. I mean, I probably leaned on people too much, but here we are, and we're talking about investigating now, so I think it works. So the investigative engine. So this is just a quick, I guess you can call this a graph of what I see as, you know, what an investigation is, right? So it starts out with questions, right? You're gonna hear the word questions a lot. That's just part of the presentation. And artifact collection, that is, you know, evidence, right? Rabbit holes, the reason I put them here is because that's very common in our field. I fall into rabbit holes every day. It's just part of it. It's just with time, you gain the ability of learning how to get out of rabbit holes at the right time. And still, I sometimes end up spending hours in a rabbit hole, and I need somebody to pull me out, but it's fine. So after you collect all the artifacts, you go through a bunch of holes, right? You then compile your findings. This is where you put everything all into one pane and try to decide or try to form a conclusion as to what happened, right? Because at the end of the day, the reason that analysts are valuable in the field is because, unlike a machine, you know, we gather evidence and we formulate our decisions based on our experiences, our bias, everything that we covered in the previous slide, and then we form a conclusion. And that usually leads to the last point, which is documentation, right? So you form a conclusion, and then you need to compile a paper or something to reflect your investigation. And again, there's going to be probably another point in this presentation when I talk about how invaluable that is. But an analyst is measured by their ability to communicate what they do. That's something that I learned the hard way, where I had to learn how to speak better and write better very quickly. Because yeah, I may understand this at a very technical level, but how I communicate what occurred to management or leadership is sometimes much more valuable than just understanding how something works technically. Because at the end of the day, an analyst is trying to relay information for the decision makers to go ahead and, you know, make the decision that they need to make based on that evidence. So that's the engine. Now we're going to divide this up into the questions, right? So these are the questions that I try to ask myself throughout the investigation. Sometimes, or at least when I first started investigating, I would have a notepad and I would just write these questions out and ensure that I can always go back and look at these questions to make sure that I'm in the right place, because I get lost. You know, there's so many things that may be happening. You're pulling logs from this machine. You're looking at, you know, endpoint logs. You're looking at network logs. You're looking at authentication logs, and then you figure out you're just, you know, all this information, you have no idea where you are. So just try to keep a mental note, if anything, of where you stand in the investigation. So the what. The what is why you're doing this in the first place. What happened, right? So let's say it can be something, if you're, you know, familiar in a SOC setting with like a ticketing system, it can be a, you know, SIM detection alert. It can be something on the news, right? It can be, you know, we've seen a lot of interesting vulnerabilities in the last weeks. So it could be something like that. Hey, we see that there's this, you know, DNS issue. Are we vulnerable to that? You know, that can spark an investigation to gain information about your environment to answer that question, right? Of course, it can be a threat hunt idea. You saw an awesome presentation by somebody about this really cool, you know, hacker thing to do something, you know, arguably bad. Well, let's see if it works in our environment. That can lead to an investigation to see if you've ever seen evidence like that or any kind of behavior like that. And of course, last but not least, organizational processes. Things just change, right? So then you may need to, oh, so now we're doing this new cloud thing, right? Are we actually putting multi-factor authentication? What does that look like? What does it not look like? How do we detect that? What do we do? And that may lead to an investigation to see, you know, how much visibility you have into that type of activity. But the what is basically what starts the investigation. So let's move on to the next question. Before that, I always forget this. And this is exactly why I have a slide for it. Always remember to question the alert first. And this slide is more geared towards the what being a alert. So this is something that I had a very difficult time understanding, and I had to write it down a lot to get it. And that is, you always question the alert first, meaning you question whether or not that alert makes sense, right? Before you start digging into, let's say the alert is, I don't know, you see that a domain administrator, I don't know, created an account on something that should never have that happen, right? Well, you know, so who created this alert logic, and what is this actually trying to capture, and how did this happen? Spend some time actually reviewing the alert to ensure that you're asking first and foremost, does this alert make sense, right? I found myself spending a lot of time going down a rabbit hole to then come to the conclusion that the logic behind the alert was actually not working properly. And it led to, you know, probably a few hours of interesting investigations. So always question that initial alert. Now let's move on to the next question. Why? So your hypothesis, this is incredibly important. This guides your entire investigation, because how you lean on the scale, right? Let's say that I see this alert and it looks like a false positive right off the bat. That bias that I've created affects the way that I'm going to, you know, obtain information. I need to be aware of that bias initially. But your why and your hypothesis are what happened the moment that you actually see the alert, your initial reaction, your gut reaction to it. So write it down. That's one of the first things that I do. Again, it can be on paper, it can be on your ticketing system, doesn't matter. Write it down, because how you feel about the alert or what your what is, again, is going to drive everything that you do from there. So I just want to kind of touch on this a little bit at the end here, where I make a question here, of course, if this sounds familiar, forming a hypothesis. And a couple examples for alerts and questions, right? So these are alerts on the left, and then the questions that actually come from these alerts. So an AV detection for a file on a domain controller, right? So a question that I would have for myself was the file actioned, deleted, quarantined, left alone? Is this, you know, a legitimate bad file, right? Because AV, as we know, just like any tool, can fail us. You know, we need to try to be as tool agnostic as possible. So file execution in an uncommon directory. Now, we've probably seen this before. I don't know, we can say probably like app data temp or something, a temporary cache file. There's a weird file execution, right? So, you know, or it can be something where the file is trying to hide in a legitimate, you know, directory, like a system32, if we're talking about Windows or something like that. So is this file, that's one of the first questions, is this file attempting to hide? Because that raises the suspicion and can raise the severity of what this alert is if you have to do any kind of escalation or any IR. So another question, of course, is, you know, email, this is a alert, email click event by a user during an active phishing campaign. Well, if you know there's an active phishing campaign, you receive an alert. Hold on, there's a couple questions. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. 1 second. Okay, awesome. There's a phishing campaign going on. Like, for example, I think Emotet just came back, what is it, Thursday or Friday? So that's interesting. And then you have alerts set up so that you are able to detect when someone may, you know, click on a phishing email, right? One of the first questions that I would ask myself is, did the, you know, user actually submit credentials? And that guides my investigation. Why? Because then I'm going to collect any, you know, data that I have that may answer that question, right? Any network type logs, hopefully you have visibility, or hopefully you have a proxy, I don't know. But, you know, some way to answer that question, right? So let's go to the next slide. So if you notice, this process is not new, right? I'm not reinventing the wheel. Anyone that's ever talked about like the investigation process is not, you know, reinventing anything, or this is not new. This is all based on what we normally do, right? As a society, and well, when we try to be scientific, right? So it all aligns with, or loosely aligns with, the scientific method, right? We have an observation, question, we form a hypothesis, we experiment. I would say experiment in this case would be gathering artifacts and gathering data. We perform our analysis on that data, and then we, actually come up with a conclusion that we communicate outbound, right? So this always makes me happy to see. It makes me feel like, what it is that I'm doing on a daily basis actually aligns with how things are discovered in the world. So there goes that. Scientific method still works. So the next question, right? So we've gone through what, gone through why, and we're going to talk a little bit about when. When is interesting because when can become very complicated if the first little square, saying here, rounded square that you see on the screen does not align between all of your logs. So timestamps. Let me give you a little story here. So I was looking at something that looked malicious, a file. Let's just stick with AV for a second. Why not? And I was looking in the SIM for evidence of execution, right? This was a Windows machine, so sysmon related, and trying to see any evidence of files being created from this executable. And I was looking and I couldn't find it, and I just felt like I was missing something, and I didn't understand what it was. And what it was that I was looking in a completely wrong time, because the alert on the endpoint occurred across the world in Asia, and I was looking at a SIM that was set up for Eastern time, and I was off by maybe 12 hours or more. So I spent about 2 to 3 hours looking for evidence of this file. And then, I went for a walk because I didn't understand why I wasn't, seeing this. And I started to question whether or not I knew anything, of course. And then I come back, I look at the alert, I start all the way back at the first thing with the what, and I notice that the alert is for a machine that is not, in Eastern time. So that was one of those, okay. So of course that led to understanding that when is incredibly important to understand. And the last point I'm going to make with this slide is if you're an analyst and you're dealing with having to correlate between things that are happening all across the world for your company or anything like that, try to set everything into UTC. You'll save a lot of unnecessary time just trying to dig into time zone conversions and things like that are not fun. All right. Where? So this question sometimes is difficult. This is more aligned with, this machine and where it's located, but now with cloud technology, that is getting a little bit less, I don't know, it's not something that you're questioning a lot because, it's hosted on some cloud service. So especially if it's like a server that has an alert or something like that. But of course we have users still, right? A lot of people are working from home, and that also makes it a little bit more difficult, right? Location of stuff. It's not in a building. And this is when, we hear this a lot in our industry. This is when asset management comes into play significantly, because answering the where has a lot to do with, if this is a laptop, for example, how you're going to get that data depends on, whether or not your asset management may have that data for you to query. The interesting thing about where is that it sometimes is answered by the when, because you'll get for example, the last time I was talking about when actually had a time zone associated to it, and that provided me the where. So sometimes the where is answered inherently when you actually answer the when question. I know I'm throwing around those words a lot, but they're all W's, so it's always interesting. All right. How? So this to me is, besides the hypothesis, which again drives your entire investigation, your how is, how this happened. How did this, whatever this may be, get here? And of course, I'm going to throw in AV again because I spent a lot of time on file type detections. you know, how did this file get into this machine, or how did this file communicate outbound when we don't allow for that, or how did we detect this? Did this logic make sense? And how does this work? How does this work? That is usually a rabbit hole, because as we all know, tactics change and techniques are modified, and things are always evolving in our field, and learning how everything works is impossible, but we do our best with rabbit holes. So again, the last one is very important, and is how impactful is this? The reason I put that last is because right here, once you're at the how and you're understanding what's going on and you're trying to put all of this together after you've answered most of your questions, then, you know, if it is very bad, or if it's like a true positive, something needs to happen, this is usually when you'll go through the policy of IR, or through, you know, escalation, you know, depending on, you know, I spent some time as a level 1 analyst, for example, and at this point, if I saw that, okay, I'm at this point and this does not look good, whatever, you know, it can be, this is spreading, we hope that never happens. Something spreading, I need to speak to an L2, I need to speak to a level 2 analyst. That is, answering the how can lead to that, okay, this is big impact, I need to do something about this. So we're gonna move into who, just to, you know, change gears a little bit. Who, attribution. So who is hard, because attribution to me can be difficult. I mean, we have so many spray and pray methods out there that could look super suspicious. I mean, if you even take a gander at your firewall logs for things that are happening, and if you're a large enough company, there's a lot of who. There's a lot of stuff happening. And of course, this brings up, you know, the threat intelligence side of things. And if you're at this point in the investigation where, you know, you've realized that this is a known tactic or a known technique through MITRE, of course, and you are able to attempt to attribute this activity to a group or something like that, that's where threat intelligence comes in. Attribution to me has always been very difficult, because of course we have, you know, the ability to copy techniques and tactics, and, you know, I can make myself look like somebody else, I can spoof this, you know. So who is hard, but who is interesting when it comes to answering this question, right? Is this an inside threat or an outside threat, right? You know, we hear about insider threat often in our industry, and that's one of the most difficult things to kind of iron out, because you know, there's like an inherent trust almost with your coworkers and things like that. So it's sometimes hard to, you know, think that they can be doing something malicious. But of course, trying to, you know, iron out or answer the who, whether or not it is an insider or outsider, drives your investigation more, depending on the data that you receive. So the who, the last point with the employee, vendor, coworker, that's just if you do find out that it is, you know, not malicious, right? You know, who was affected by this? Let's say that it's a file that, you know, someone downloaded from somewhere because they thought it would look interesting. You know, it's not always like a malicious activity. It's more of like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be downloading that. And then of course that leads to answering who did this, so you can reach out and communicate to them. The reason I put that there is because one of the things I feel very strongly about is how security people in a company are viewed. The way that we communicate and the way that we build bridges between other departments is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, we're all kind of trying to do the same thing. And I've seen a lot of negativity thrown towards like security teams and things like that, because we're usually the people telling people to stop doing stuff. So of course, just remembering that there can be a person at the other side of the fence when you're looking at something, it's very important to keep things, you know, nice. We want to be liked, so that when things happen, you know, we're able to respond more effectively. So we're now towards the end of this presentation, and we're going to talk a little bit about a write-up. Now, I spoke to a lot of people that are on the red side of the red team side of things, and I spend most of my time talking to people within the blue side. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to do the same thing. But our efforts, again, I'm going to emphasize this, our efforts are judged or graded or valued based on how we communicate, right? One of the things that is very hard for us is documentation. Yeah. I've talked to some people that are incredible when it comes to, how they can break into a system, right? But they'll usually say the write-up is like the most, not the fun part, right? We're not at the fun part at this point. Gathering evidence for me and trying to correlate between different data sources, to me, is like a game, and I really enjoy it. But writing it up is not fun. So here is the benefit of answering those questions. In your mind, on a notepad or on a text editor, whatever you want to use, is that usually you can just kind of copy paste or brain dump most of your answers into a very good document. I mean, I even write documents sometimes about an investigation with the subheaders or subsections being the question themselves. I'll have like, what, this happened, why, because of this, who was involved because of this, and I'll word it like that because it aligns with the way that I did the investigation, and it doesn't make it so that I'm recreating a document, right? So one of the things that are incredibly important as you kind of put all this together as analysts is, what did you do, right? So I can say I was able to collect this log from this machine, and I did it at this time, and I grabbed it from this location. So when did you take these actions was answered by that, right? So I did it at 7 a.m. The alert came in at 6:50 a.m. I hope that's not happening. That's too early, but things happen. So what answers did you obtain? Well, I was not, the logs themselves were inconclusive, or they did not yield any evidence of there being malicious activity surrounding this alert, right? Is escalation required? This is, usually people are aware of this. Once you escalate, you ring the bell, things happen, people will know, but it's always really important to state that it happened. Why? When a manager is looking at this, or someone in some kind of leadership role is looking at this, this is what they want to know, right? What happened, what was done, what policies were invoked or things actually occurred, what was the conclusion? So let's talk about that. False positive, true positive, false negative. Usually when it comes to this question, I try to, for example, if it's a false positive, I'll try to explain why and try to suggest some kind of fix for this, right? If it's a false positive and it's due to the logic itself that was attempting to find this suspicious binary, well, maybe the binary or that way that binary works is no longer relevant. So we may need to tune the alert or the logic a little bit. So suggestions are always great, especially for those that are writing, detection logic. And of course, this last point is always provide contextual data. I am big on schedules, right? I mean, I'd probably drive Siri insane with how many times I tell her to schedule something on my calendar and things like that. But timestamps and like how things happen and providing, when you say, I grabbed this log from this machine, right? I usually do this, I'll put in parentheses, what log, right? I want to avoid anyone that's reading what I'm writing to reach out and ask me for clarification. I want it to be as clear and as concise as I possibly can make it. Because what happens when they question you is that you may forget what happened, and then the conversation may change, and then things may not, there may be gaps in the investigation as a whole. That's never fun, to have to redo an investigation. So provide as much contextual data into your write-up. So let's move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to throw out a quick hypothesis. I know I talked a little bit about the questions that you asked. I just wanted to give a quick alert example. Again, we're going to just keep messing with Windows here and some AV stuff because it happens. And we have this malicious file in this weird location, which is normally what happens. except for, attackers now are, they're realizing that so many people are monitoring these directories, but that's fine. So you're going to form a hypothesis, right? So I believe that there should not be this specific hash executing from this specific directory. My hypothesis is the machine is compromised, right? So I'm looking for evidence of that compromise while also trying to prove myself wrong, right? Like you're trying to say, okay, if I find the evidence, right, then now I know that my hypothesis is right, but you spend as much time looking for evidence of it not occurring, right? I mean, no one wants things to be compromised, but it happens. So again, the hypothesis drives the evidence and drives the way that you look at the investigation. So now there's a lot of words on this slide, and I apologize for that. I try to make this as condensed and concise as I could, but this is an example, right? So we looked at that AV detection and, as an example, and I did a write-up here that encapsulates kind of what it is that I'm trying to, indicate here. And that is providing evidence and, contextual data is what allows for leadership to make a decision or to view the value in your work, right? So I'm not going to read this, it's a lot, honestly, but again, as you can see, with some words, I'll put, when something happened, on which machine it happened, what was the file name, what was the OSINT information that, led to me believing something, was either malicious or not malicious, providing links for these websites, for example, like VirusTotal and, hybrid analysis or whatever it is that you use. If you use a sandbox like Joe Sandbox or something like that, what were the IOCs that you observed, providing all that stuff. And I love when there's a bunch of attachments on a write-up, right? And they'll be like, hey, I have this attachment of this screenshot that shows this thing that I was looking for. Those are great. Those provide, me, okay, so this is what you found. And of course, there's some good here where if you are working with other analysts, or in my case, like you're trying to, build up an analyst, or, trying to work on the skill set of an analyst, right? You can always review this and provide suggestions, right? Feedback. You can look at the write-up and, gauge whether or not, hey, a pivot would have been really cool right here. This would have led for this type of artifact collection from this log source, something like that. But this is just, an example write-up of something that, I see often with stuff happening on files. So last note on write-ups, of course, this is probably 4 or 5 more questions. Just always keep this in mind. Your write-ups can invoke change in a process as an organization. You want to ensure, as an analyst that is providing data, that your data is sound and that it makes the most sense. Because what I've seen in the past is when those decisions are made by leadership, they'll reference your write-up. You want that to be impeccable. You want that to be, everything. You want to pour everything into that. And I feel very strongly about that. It, again, emphasizes your value as an analyst. So write it with that expectation. Sometimes I've done this myself, where I may not spend as much time investigating a false positive. I've already determined it's a false positive. I've answered all the questions and I write it up, and I just, I'm moving on to the next fun thing, right? What I've fallen victim to because of my own actions is, maybe one of those tickets, even though it's a false positive, they're grabbed to look at, to review, and it doesn't look that great. So what I do is I'm probably arguably too verbose sometimes, but I make sure that most of my write-ups, if not all, are written with the expectation that at any point this can be used as reference material. This can be used to teach somebody, or to guide another investigation, because sometimes investigations are related. Okay, so another point. Would anyone be able to replicate the actions you took? This is incredibly important. So if you have access to the same data that I have, and you are able to pull the same data that I'm able to pull as an analyst, can you use my write-up to recreate the investigation. The reason that this is incredibly powerful is because when you are working in a team setting, right, as a SOC or whatever analyst type role, it's always awesome to be able to understand why someone did something or why, you know, someone chose this way of working on the investigation. I always find those to be really interesting. And the only way to really do that is to be able to replicate the actions that you took or they took, right? So I write my write-ups in a way that anyone can look at it and see what I was thinking. Okay, so did this investigation lead to potential improvement in detection? I talked a little bit about how false positives, at least how I feel they should be addressed. You know, there are false positives that can't benefit from tuning, but the majority of false positives probably could use a little bit of, you know, marinating here or there to make it a little bit better. So at least in my opinion, from my experience. So that's always really good to be aware of, that if you change logic, well, they might ask you why. And if you have a really thorough write-up, you can just point them to the write-up and say, this is why, right? Because of this, because all this action took place and it didn't make sense under the context of this alert logic. All right, so another point, would senior leadership be able to use this write-up to address any concerns? Now we kind of answered this before, just wanted to put a big point to this again, because I've seen this happen time and time again. Your write-ups will be used as evidence, or as, you know, hey, our SOC saw this, did this, and we are now doing this. So just keep that in mind. So did you document your findings and or conclusions in a wiki? I'm just going to throw wiki out there. Whatever it is that your team uses to put all your knowledge into is what this is about. Documentation, not only of your findings, not only of your write-up, but of your conclusions. This may aid somebody that is going to have the same investigation, you know, or similar investigation about a similar alert or the similar what. So it's always good to kind of put all this together, not only a write-up for leadership, but then have a write-up or at least a condensed version of this to explain your actions and put it in a wiki, because of course, you know, one of the things that's amazing about this field is the ability to be able to transfer information and knowledge and what you know to other people. So wikis are very powerful with that. So I feel like I've probably ran a little bit over, I'm not sure. I just kind of left this slide open for more examples. I tried to cover them during the slides as much as possible. So I'll just kind of put this slide up as a question, if anyone has any questions or anything that they, you know, want to talk about in regards to this. I'm open.
Christopher.
How you doing?
Okay, a great presentation. You indicated thorough, bulletproof documentation. Is that practical in a busy, stressful environment where before you even finish one investigation, you already have another event? So how would you be able to put all the thoroughness into a write-up?
Yes, so the way that I do it, and of course, this may only, you know, work for me, so I'm just gonna relay what works for me. The way that I do it is most of the time while I'm going through an investigation and I'm trying to end the investigation, I'm trying to get to a conclusion, my write-up will be a collection of the questions that I answered in the first place. So my write-ups, as thorough as they may be, usually at the end of the investigation, if I copy paste my notes and my evidence, I already have kind of a rough draft of an investigation, like of my notes and everything. And when I spend the most time kind of freshening it up or making it better is like, sometimes it has to be after. Because as you said, like in our field, you know, I can't express how many times something happens, right? Like, you know, you hear the news and this new vulnerability, for example, and then this is happening, and then, oh, this person's happening, and of course this user fell for this phishing thing, and all that's happening all at the same time usually. So of course we have to try to have the best work-life balance possible, but I will tell you that I spend a lot of time, sometimes after work, you know, editing some of my write-ups because I want them to be great. But if I need to just, you know, answer those questions, give it to management, make them aware of what's going on, they're still going to encapsulate those questions. They're still going to have that fundamental rough draft of what it is that I'm trying to make sure that they have knowledge of. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but that's how I kind of do it. I try to get everything in paper, and if I need to make edits later, I go ahead and do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
All right, any other questions? It looks like also, Christopher, a couple of people DM'd you, so you may have a couple of DMs there.
Oh, awesome. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, if there's no questions, I mean, we can kind of end this presentation.
All right, that's it. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for sharing, Chris and Stephanie. I hope you guys enjoy your weekend. I'm going to go ahead and if nobody has any other questions, I'm going to shut this down in just a second. It'll take a couple minutes for the recording to render, and then I'm going to chop a couple things off of it, but we'll get it posted into the channel so you guys can see it later. Thank you guys for sharing your Saturday with us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye.
Bye. Great job, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. You as well.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Bye.
Yeah, definitely.